My name is Erwin McRae, and I turned 74 last winter. For most of my life, I was a high school history teacher in a small town in Indiana. The kind of man who wore cardigans with elbow patches and still believed in handwritten thank you notes and proper introductions. I retired the year my wife, Mabel, passed away. That was 6 years ago, though the pain of her absence has not dulled one bit. Mabel was my compass, my rhythm, my reason. When she died, the house felt so large and silent that even the sound of the fridge humming at night made me feel like I was trespassing in someone else's space. The days stretched endlessly, each one blending into the next. I kept the curtains open to let in the sunlight, but it rarely helped. Silence has a weight to it, a density, and in that house it pressed on my chest like a cinder block. My son, Patrick, suggested that I sell the house and come live with him and his wife, Lindsay. At first, I hesitated. Pride, perhaps, or maybe the fear of becoming someone else's burden. But they insisted. "We've got plenty of room," Patrick had said over the phone. "The basement is finished. It has a separate entrance and a bathroom. It'll be like having your own apartment. And the kids would love to have Grandpa around." I remember that call distinctly because I had just burned my lunch trying to heat soup, and the fire alarm had startled me so badly that I dropped the pot on the floor. I was grateful for the offer. Grateful to not have to eat in silence every day. Grateful that someone still wanted me near. So I sold the house Mabel and I had built together and moved into their home on the outskirts of Indianapolis. The basement was as described. A spacious, clean area with a couch, a small kitchenette, and my own bathroom. They had even set up a bookshelf with my old history volumes and framed a photo of Mabel and me from our 35th anniversary. For a time, I believed this would be a second act. I imagined helping with homework, telling stories from my years in the classroom, perhaps even teaching my grandkids how to play chess like Mabel once taught me. That illusion didn't last long. Patrick had grown distant over the years. He was always working, always rushing, always checking his phone. The man who used to spend hours building model airplanes with me now barely made eye contact at dinner. Lindsay was cordial at first, smiling in that tight way that never reached her eyes. She worked in real estate and was always on the go, always dressed like she was heading into battle. Their children, Hannah and Lucas, were teenagers, forever plugged into their screens and earbuds. They mumbled greetings, if that. No one really sat down for meals. No one asked how my day was. But I told myself it was just adjustment, that I would find my place again. I tried to stay out of their way. I did my own grocery shopping with my pension, cooked my meals, even bought my own detergent. I helped when I could, fixing a broken drawer, mowing the lawn when my knees allowed it, picking up Hannah from school when her mother was stuck in a showing. I thought of these things not as chores, but as contributions. Proof that I wasn't just occupying space, but gradually the signs began to appear. Subtle at first, Lindsay started making comments like, "We really need to declutter around here," while staring directly at my book collection. She once asked if I could keep my junk in bins so that it doesn't mess with the aesthetic. The coffee maker from upstairs disappeared one day, and when I asked about it, she said she needed it for her open houses. When I offered to buy another, she said, "No, that's okay, Dad. You don't drink that much anyway." Soon after, the microwave followed. Then the chair from the basement that I loved, an old recliner I'd had since the 90s, was gone. I found it in the garage, covered in a tarp. It was taking up space, she'd said, and the smell was kind of musty. Patrick rarely intervened. He seemed caught between roles, dutiful son and exhausted husband, and I could see the internal conflict in his eyes. Once I overheard them arguing late at night. Lindsay's voice was shrill, sharp, cutting through the vents like knives. "He just sits down there like a damn ghost," she snapped. "We can't keep doing this forever, Pat. This is our home." That word, ghost, stuck with me. I'd never thought of myself that way, as someone haunting a space that didn't want me. But the truth of it landed with cruel clarity. I was in their home. Not mine. Not anymore. They never outright asked me to leave. But every change, every exclusion, every missing item whispered it louder than words ever could. I tried harder to be invisible, to not ask for rides, to do my laundry when no one else was home, to cook meals that didn't leave odors upstairs. Once I apologized for using the oven. Lindsay rolled her eyes and said, "It's not a crime, Irwin. Just try not to burn anything, okay?" I smiled and nodded, because what else could I do? I'd sold my house. My savings were modest. A retirement home was out of the question, not just financially but emotionally. The idea of ending my days among strangers made my stomach twist. I wanted to believe I still had a place, still had worth. But some nights, as I lay on the hard mattress of the basement bed, I'd hear laughter upstairs, my grandchildren, my son, Lindsay, and I'd feel like the basement itself was swallowing me. I remembered how Mabel used to insist on family dinners, on board game nights, on Sunday picnics. Our home had always been loud, cluttered, full of warmth. Now I lived beneath a house that was silent to me. And I began to wonder, had I lived too long? Had I overstayed my welcome in a world that had already said its goodbyes? One evening, after Patrick and Lindsay left for a dinner party and the kids were locked in their rooms, I found a note taped to the fridge in the kitchen upstairs. It wasn't addressed to me, but it might as well have been. Written in Lindsay's meticulous handwriting, it read, "We need to talk about long-term plans for Irwin. This can't go on forever." I stared at the note for a long time, my hands shaking. It wasn't the words. It was the fact that they'd been written, not spoken, as if I were a thing to be dealt with, not a man, not a father, not a grandfather, but a problem, a burden, a waste of space. And that night, as I sat back down in the basement, surrounded by books no one would ever borrow and photographs no one asked about, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to push me out. I wasn't going to be discarded like a piece of old furniture. I would find out what I still had left, of my rights, of my dignity. And when the time came, I would remind them that even a ghost can still move through walls. It was a Saturday morning when everything shifted. Not with an explosion, not with some grand confrontation, but with the kind of quiet violence that leaves no marks and yet never heals. The kind of moment so ordinary on the surface, you almost miss its meaning, until it festers beneath your ribs like a thorn that won't dislodge. I'd come upstairs to make oatmeal. It was something I did once a week, usually when the rest of the house was still asleep. I liked the silence of the kitchen before the blender and the coffee grinder and the constant, impatient sighs of modern life. The light coming through the east-facing window warmed the tile beneath my feet. I was stirring milk into the pot when Lindsay walked in, her hair wet from the shower, wearing leggings and a sweatshirt that probably cost more than my entire outfit. She didn't greet me. That had become normal. We had long moved past the stage of courtesy. Instead, she opened the fridge, retrieved a cold-pressed juice, and stood leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone like I wasn't there. I said softly, "Good morning, Lindsay." She didn't respond right away, just kept swiping. Then she looked up, and I'll never forget the way she tilted her head, as if seeing me for the first time. Not in surprise, but in frustration. "You used the last of the almond milk," she said flatly. I blinked, not understanding. I thought it was the house milk. I always buy regular milk for myself. Yes, but that almond milk was for my smoothies. It's $5 a bottle, Irwin. I looked at the nearly empty pot on the stove. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I can go get another one. She snorted. You don't drive, and Pat's got the car. So, no, you can't. The way she said it, like a verdict, made something brittle snap inside me. I opened my mouth to apologize again, but before I could speak, she set the juice bottle on the counter a little too hard and crossed her arms. You know, this isn't working anymore. I turned to face her fully. What isn't? This situation. You. Living here. It was supposed to be temporary. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the sharpness beneath it. It's been almost 5 years. And no offense, but it's starting to feel like, I don't know, like dead weight. I stood there, holding the wooden spoon, trying to keep my face calm. I pay rent, Lindsay. I pay for groceries. I help around the house. Barely, she said, laughing dryly. Come on, you shuffle around in your slippers, you heat soup, you nap. Pat and I are carrying all the real responsibilities, and it's exhausting to constantly walk on eggshells just because you're older. You asked me to come, I said. Patrick said you wanted the kids to be close to their grandfather. Yeah, well, that was before we realized what that meant. Before we realized it's like having a third child in the basement, except this one forgets to turn off the oven and leaves the lights on all night. I hadn't done either of those things. Not once. I see, I said quietly. You don't see, she snapped, slapping her hand on the counter. You just sulk down there in your little cave, pretending you're doing us a favor by being invisible. But you're not invisible, Irwin. You're a presence, a weight. And it's getting harder to breathe in this house. At that moment, Patrick entered the kitchen, still in his sweatpants, rubbing his eyes. He looked from Lindsay to me and seemed to instantly understand the tone of the room. What's going on? He asked, voice groggy. Your father used the almond milk, Lindsay said, not taking her eyes off me. And we're talking about the fact that maybe it's time to make some changes around here. Patrick sighed. Linz, not now. If not now, when? She said, turning on him. He's never going to leave unless we say something. He's going to live in our basement until he dies. And then what? We inherit the bills and the guilt. Patrick looked uncomfortable. He glanced at me and I hoped, he might say something kind, something protective, something like the boy I once raised. But he didn't. He just rubbed his temples and said, Maybe we should all sit down and talk when it's not so tense. Sure, she said, grabbing her juice and walking out of the kitchen. Let's schedule a meeting about the ghost in our basement. Add it to the calendar between therapy and taxes. And, just like that, she was gone. Patrick didn't look at me. He poured himself coffee, took one sip, then left the room without a word. I stood alone, the pot still simmering on the stove, the spoon still in my hand, the air thick with something worse than anger, dismissal. I went back downstairs, not hungry anymore. That afternoon, I sat in my recliner and stared at the framed photo of Mabel on the shelf. She was wearing the blue dress she'd worn to Hannah's christening. Her eyes twinkled with kindness and curiosity, and I imagined her standing in that kitchen, watching her daughter-in-law speak to her husband like that. She would have stepped in. She would have protected me. She always did. I turned off the light early that evening. I didn't want to be seen anymore. I didn't want to exist in a house where I was considered a burden, a shadow. But the word Lindsay had used, weight, kept echoing in my head. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because it revealed everything. I was no longer part of their life. I was furniture, an item on a spreadsheet, an extra mouth, an expense, an inconvenience. Not once had they asked how I was doing. Not once had they thanked me for the money I contributed, or the errands I ran, or the hundreds of small things I did to preserve peace in that house. I had become a relic. Something to be tolerated, managed, hidden away. But what Lindsay didn't know, what Patrick had clearly forgotten, was that I was not just a passive figure in a dusty photograph. I had built a life. I had made sacrifices. I had taught generations of students, buried friends and a wife, endured a heart attack and 2 surgeries. I had survived. And I was not going to let the last years of my life be spent in a basement being spoken about like I was already gone. That night, I sat at my desk and began pulling out paperwork. Bank records, old letters, property forms. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I felt like a man digging through ashes for a still-burning ember. There had to be something I'd forgotten, some detail, some leverage, something that proved I still had ground to stand on, something that could remind my family that the ghost in the basement still had a name. The week following that confrontation was marked by a silence so precise and deliberate it almost felt rehearsed. Lindsay no longer spoke to me directly. If she needed something conveyed, she passed it through Patrick or left a terse note taped to the fridge. Patrick, in turn, had adopted the mannerisms of a man in bureaucratic limbo, neither defending me nor attacking me, simply navigating around my presence with the weary neutrality of someone trying not to trigger landmines. The tension in the house became a presence all its own. It hung in the air like humidity before a storm, and I found myself moving more quietly, turning off the television when footsteps passed by upstairs, timing my use of the washing machine so it wouldn't overlap with Lindsay's preferred schedule. The basement, once a refuge, began to feel like a box closing in on me. Then came the small but sharp reductions, each one framed in the language of household management, each one a cut so subtle it could be called circumstantial. The microwave I used disappeared one morning. When I asked Patrick about it, he said, "It wasn't working properly. Lindsay took it to be recycled." No replacement came. A few days later, the coffee maker vanished. "Too much clutter on the counter," Patrick offered with a weak shrug. "We're streamlining." The final straw was the recliner. My recliner. The one piece of furniture I had insisted on bringing with me from my old house. Mabel had bought it for me on our 30th wedding anniversary after I came home from a school district conference with a sore back. It had been reupholstered once, and yes, it sagged a little on one side, but it still cradled my body in a way no other chair ever had. I had fallen asleep in that recliner during thunderstorms, read every book of my retirement in it, and once held my infant grandson in its worn arms while he napped on my chest. One morning, it was gone. Just gone. The corner where it had stood now held a plastic storage bin full of cleaning supplies. I went upstairs, seething but composed, and asked Lindsay where it was. She didn't even look up from her laptop. Garage. We needed more space down there. It was collecting dust and triggering Hannah's allergies. "You put my chair in the garage?" "It's better than the curb, Irwin," she said, finally glancing at me with a smile so tight it could have cracked porcelain. I stood in stunned silence, waiting for Patrick to interject, to say something, anything. He was sitting across from her, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. I turned without another word and walked to the garage. The recliner was there, wedged between a lawnmower and a stack of flattened Amazon boxes. A thin veil of dust had already begun to settle on the armrests. I stood over it for a long time, my fists clenched, my breath shallow. I wanted to carry it back downstairs. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat in it, in the dim chill of the garage, and let the silence do what it had been doing for months. Erode me, quietly. That evening, over dinner, which I took in my basement alone, as always, I tried to remind myself that I was still a guest in their home, that I had accepted this arrangement willingly, that compromises were part of multi-generational living. But another voice, one I had not heard in a long time, had begun to surface within me. It was the voice of the man who had raised a family on a teacher's salary, the man who had fought with the school board for better conditions for his students, the man who had held Mabel's hand through chemotherapy. That voice said, "This is not what you agreed to. This is not kindness. This is erasure." The next morning, Lindsay came into the basement. A rare occurrence. She was holding a basket of folded laundry, my laundry, and placed it on the bed without comment. I said thank you. She didn't respond. As she turned to leave, she paused and looked around. "You know, we were talking about converting this space into a home office," she said casually. "It gets good light, and with Patrick working from home more often, it would be useful." I stared at her. "Where would I go?" She smiled. "We haven't decided yet. Maybe an assisted living place." Or we could look into one of those senior communities with activities and shuttles. You might like it." I laughed once, bitterly. "You mean somewhere I can be out of sight but still close enough to send you checks on birthdays?" She stiffened. "That's not fair, isn't it? You're twisting this into something ugly." "We're just trying to reclaim our space." "It was never yours to reclaim," I said, standing. "I paid for part of this house. I helped you with the down payment. I remember the paperwork. You asked me to be a co-owner to help secure the loan." Her face changed. It was a flicker, something tight around the eyes, but I saw it. A calculation, followed by the forced return to composure. "That was symbolic," she said. "A formality. You didn't really want any control." "Maybe I didn't then," I said. "But now, I'm starting to remember that I have some rights." "Don't threaten me," she said, her voice going cold. "No one's threatening," I replied, just recalling the facts. Later that day, I dug through my old file boxes, the ones I had kept neatly labeled with dates and categories. I found the property documents. My name was there, bold as day. Irwin McRae, co-owner, not co-tenant. Not occupant. Owner. Equal rights. I sat with that truth, letting it grow roots beneath me. That evening, Lindsay told the kids, casually at the dinner table upstairs, that we were looking into options for Grandpa, as if I were a misplaced heirloom. I wasn't invited to that meal, of course, but I heard it through the vents. Heard Lucas mutter, "About time," and Hannah ask if that meant she could take over the basement. My stomach twisted. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk until dawn, surrounded by dusty folders and the echoes of a house I no longer recognized. The woman who had smiled at me when I moved in, who had once thanked me for helping them build a life together, had turned me into a line item on her decluttering list. And Patrick, my son, my only child, had watched it all and said nothing. I remembered when he was 6 years old and got lost at the fair, how I had run frantically through the crowds, shouting his name until my throat went raw, how he had clung to me afterward, sobbing into my neck. I had held him and whispered, "I'll always come for you, no matter what." And now, as an old man, I realized he would not do the same for me. He would not come for me. He would let me go. The following day, I went to the county records office and requested a full deed copy for the house. The clerk was polite. She handed me the papers. Everything confirmed it. I had legal standing. I could not be evicted. I could not be relocated. That night, I sat on my bed, holding the documents like a shield. For months, I had been shrinking, making myself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. But now, I felt something else stirring, an old, stubborn dignity. The kind of pride that doesn't shout, but also doesn't yield. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I was done playing the ghost in the basement. The moment that changed everything did not come with a grand confrontation or a thunderous outburst, but rather arrived quietly, like the slow creak of a door opening in the dead of night. It was an ordinary afternoon when Patrick's phone rang while I was quietly reading in the basement. I heard snippets of the conversation before Patrick abruptly stood up, his face tightening into a mask of seriousness that I had not seen in years. After he hung up, he looked toward the basement stairs as if hesitating to speak to me but knowing he had to. "Dad," he began, voice low, "we need to talk about something important." I set down my book and nodded, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. Patrick sat down across from me, hands clasped together, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the floor. "It's about your health," he said finally. "Lindsay and I have noticed some things that concern us." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. "What kind of things?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling. "Memory lapses," Patrick answered, carefully choosing his words. "Forgetting appointments, misplacing things, Lindsay says she's seen you confused sometimes." I opened my mouth to protest, but he raised a hand gently. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Dad. We just want to make sure you're okay." I wanted to tell him that I was fine, that the occasional misplaced keys or forgotten word was part of normal aging, not a decline. But the doubt they sowed was beginning to take root. Over the next few days, their concern transformed into a slow siege. Lindsay began scheduling doctor's appointments without my knowledge, and Patrick called me with reminders to take tests and fill out questionnaires I barely understood. They spoke in hushed tones upstairs, referring to specialists and assessments, their voices a blend of care and something colder, more clinical. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman in a white coat, clipboard in hand. "Mr. McRae?" she asked kindly. "I'm Dr. Simmons. I'm here to conduct a cognitive evaluation." I was stunned. They had arranged for this behind my back. Over the next hour, I answered questions I didn't want to hear. I struggled to recall details of my childhood, names of past presidents, and dates of historical events I had taught for decades. The questions felt designed to trip me up. I could sense the judgment behind her polite tone. When it was over, I felt exhausted and diminished, as if a part of me had been peeled away. Days later, Patrick showed me the results. "There's some mild cognitive impairment," he said cautiously. "It's not dementia, but it's something we should monitor." I looked at the page, at the cold, clinical words that seemed to strip me bare. They had been watching, analyzing, categorizing me as fragile and declining. Lindsay arrived soon after with a brochure for a senior care community. "It's a beautiful place," she said, "with activities, medical staff, and people your age." I wanted to scream that I was not done living, that I was still the man who had weathered storms far worse than this quiet surrender. But the walls were closing in. They began taking over my mail, calling my doctors to discuss appointments without me, and even changing the locks upstairs, saying it was for my safety. I was slowly being erased. One night I sat alone in the basement, the only light coming from the soft glow of a reading lamp. I thought of Mabel and how she would have fought tooth and nail for me, how she would have demanded respect and dignity. But she was gone, and I was left to navigate this storm without her steady hand. I resolved then that I would not let them define me by their fears and frustrations. I began gathering documents, medical records, legal papers, anything that could prove my competence and rights. I found a local elder law attorney who agreed to help me understand what protections I had. The journey was exhausting and humbling, but it was also a reclaiming. Slowly, I started attending support groups and community centers, reconnecting with the world beyond the basement walls. I found strength in small victories, a doctor who listened, a neighbor who stopped to chat, a letter from the attorney affirming my rights. This middle point in my story was a crucible. It tested my resolve and forced me to confront not only the betrayals of those closest to me, but also the quiet fears within myself. But through the darkness, a new purpose began to emerge. I would fight not just for my home, but for my identity and dignity, and I would do it on my terms. The shift from passive control to active deceit began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if Lindsay and Patrick had decided that subtlety was more effective than confrontation. After the failed attempt to present me as mentally impaired, I thought perhaps they would retreat, recalibrate, even reflect. But instead, they changed their strategy. They stopped discussing care homes, stopped pushing evaluations. Instead, they turned warm, accommodating and overly helpful in a way that set off every internal alarm I possessed. Lindsay began making me breakfast, something she hadn't done once in the previous 5 years. She left cheerful notes outside the basement door. "Have a great day, Irwin," or "Let me know if you need anything." Patrick started calling me Dad again, not just hey or nothing at all. There were even small gifts, a new robe, a book on World War II aviation, a bottle of whiskey I hadn't asked for but used to enjoy on winter nights before Mabel died. And I knew what they were doing. It wasn't reconciliation. It was seduction, the kind that precedes betrayal. I remembered the house documents, the deed that bore my name alongside theirs. I remembered the lawyer who told me I had an equal third in ownership. That detail hadn't changed. It hadn't gone anywhere. What had changed, I suspected, was their plan to make me give it up voluntarily. It came to a head the day Patrick invited me to lunch, just the two of us. No Lindsay, no grandkids, no intermediaries. It had been years since he asked me for anything that didn't involve a bank transfer or house repair. We went to a small cafe in town, one I used to frequent with Mabel. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he stirred his coffee, in the way he cleared his throat 3 times before saying anything real. "Dad," he began, "I just wanted to say how grateful we are that you've been with us. These years haven't been easy, but I know it's meant a lot to the kids to have their grandfather around." I said nothing. He continued, "And I know things got tense for a while, but Lindsay and I have been talking, and we'd like to make things easier for everyone." I waited. The pitch was coming. "We're thinking about refinancing the house," he said. "Interest rates are low, and we want to take care of some debt and maybe do a few renovations. Nothing crazy, just improvements that would help everyone, including you. More space, better insulation, a new HVAC system so your basement isn't freezing all winter." "And you need my signature," I said flatly. He winced, then nodded. "Technically, yeah. You're a co-owner. The bank needs all parties on the deed to agree to the new terms. But it's just paperwork. You wouldn't be responsible for anything financially." "Why now?" I asked. "Why the sudden generosity?" He blinked, then smiled. "We just want to move forward. A fresh start. Let go of the past, you know?" I didn't believe him for a second, but I agreed to think about it. That evening, I reviewed the paperwork they left on my nightstand. It wasn't refinancing. It was a transfer of ownership disguised as a loan adjustment. The fine print made it clear. By signing, I would relinquish my 1/3 ownership of the property and reduce my role to that of a resident without legal standing. I spent the next 2 hours staring at those pages, stunned not by their deceit, but by the elegance of it. They'd had it drafted by a professional. No doubt Lindsay's doing. She knew real estate. She knew how to bury betrayal in clauses and footnotes. The next morning, I made an appointment with my lawyer. He confirmed what I suspected and advised me not to sign. "If you do," he said, "they can evict you within a month, and you'll have no legal recourse." I nodded. "What if I start the process of selling my share?" "You can," he said carefully, "but they'll resist." Co-owned property sales can get ugly if the owners aren't cooperative. "I don't need cooperation," I said. "I need closure." Over the next week, I began assembling a war chest. I contacted a realtor, an old acquaintance who remembered me from my teaching days. She agreed to assess the property discreetly and confirmed that my share, if sold independently, could be worth upwards of $200,000 depending on the market. That was more than enough to relocate, to rebuild, to start over. The only catch was timing. I had to act before they did, before they manipulated the law again. But Lindsay and Patrick weren't sitting idle. That same week, I discovered that my bank account had been flagged for unusual activity. A $10,000 wire had been initiated to a new account in Lindsay's name. I hadn't approved it. When I confronted Patrick, he looked genuinely surprised. "Must be some kind of mistake," he said, then avoided my eyes. I froze the transfer, changed my passwords, and removed their access from my financial portfolio. They retaliated by cutting off my internet and phone. I knew it was them. They told the provider I had moved out and no longer needed service. I spent an entire day restoring it. dealing with customer service agents who spoke to me like I was a confused octogenarian asking how to turn on a laptop. They underestimated me. They always had. What they didn't know was that I had documented everything: the faked refinancing papers, the unauthorized wire transfer, the unilateral service terminations, and the previous attempt to present me as cognitively impaired. I compiled it all into a folder marked Protective Measures and gave a copy to my lawyer with explicit instructions. If something happens to me, I said, this gets released. The pressure intensified. Lindsay became colder, sharper. She barely masked her contempt anymore. "You're ruining everything," she told me one night when Patrick wasn't home. "We were trying to help you, to make this manageable. But no, you had to be difficult." "No," I said calmly. "I had to be present. You can't erase a man just because he's inconvenient." "You want to be alone," she hissed. "Fine, be alone. But don't come crawling back when you realize that no one wants to deal with a bitter old man." That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since moving in. Not out of fear, out of strategy. The battle had become psychological. I couldn't afford sleepwalking through it. I was dealing with people who didn't see family, they saw liability. I began moving my valuables out, slowly, piece by piece. Important documents, personal mementos, the few items I still cherished. I took them to a storage locker under a pseudonym. I didn't trust them not to retaliate once they discovered I wasn't going to bend. And then it came. The notice. A formal letter, printed on thick cardstock and delivered by courier. Lindsay had initiated legal proceedings to have me declared mentally unfit. She claimed I was endangering myself, that I had been confused, forgetful, and possibly a fire hazard. Patrick co-signed the petition. I sat in the basement holding that letter for nearly an hour, heart pounding, hands shaking not with fear, but with something colder. Resolve. They weren't trying to negotiate. They were trying to eliminate. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. I immediately underwent an independent psychiatric and cognitive evaluation at my lawyer's request. 3 specialists signed off on my full competency, declaring me lucid, capable, and legally protected. We counterfiled the documents, attaching proof of their financial manipulation and attempts to transfer ownership without my consent. The hearing was brief. The judge read the files, reviewed the evidence, and dismissed their petition with visible disgust. Lindsay refused to make eye contact. Patrick looked pale. When the judge warned them about potential elder abuse charges if further manipulation occurred, I saw something break in Patrick. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps just fear. After the hearing, I walked past them without a word. I stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse and inhaled deeply. The war wasn't over. But I had won the first battle, and I had no intention of stopping there. The silence after the court hearing was not peace. It was the pause before a final strike. Lindsay and Patrick did not speak to me directly for days. The house became a pressure chamber, the air thick with tension and stifled resentment. I no longer tried to bridge the gap. Whatever thread of family once connected us had burned away in the courtroom. Now we were only co-inhabitants, legal adversaries in the shell of a home. But even then, they were not done. I knew they were preparing something. I could feel it in the way Lindsay walked, faster than usual, her eyes darting, calculating. I could see it in the way Patrick avoided my gaze, his guilt curdled into bitterness. They were up to something, but I didn't know what until I overheard their conversation late one night through the floor vent. They didn't know I had rerouted the heating system to feed audio into my basement bedroom. I heard Lindsay say, "We have to move fast. He's got a lawyer now. If he sells, we're screwed." Patrick replied, "Then maybe we make the house unbearable. He won't want to stay." "It's already unbearable," Lindsay snapped. "What do you want me to do? Poison his cereal?" She laughed. But it wasn't a joke. Nothing was anymore. Patrick didn't laugh. He whispered something I couldn't make out. Then Lindsay said, "You know what I wish? I wish he'd just leave one day and never come back. Just vanish, like old people sometimes do. Wouldn't that be convenient?" It wasn't rage I felt. It was something deeper, a severing, a realization that this wasn't simply neglect, or a difference of priorities, or even resentment. This was hatred, cold, considered, and institutional. The hatred of someone who wants your erasure not out of anger, but efficiency. The next morning, I went to my lawyer and initiated the process to sell my share of the house. He connected me with a real estate broker named Claudia, sharp, professional, with a sympathy that didn't condescend. She explained the steps. "We'll file a notice of intent to sell. If your co-owners don't agree, we can push for a partition action. It's legal, though contentious, but with your documentation, it's strong." That night, I served the notice. I did it in person. I waited until dinner, knocked on the door to the dining room like a guest in my own house, and handed Lindsay and Patrick the envelope. "What's this?" Patrick asked, confused. "My formal intention to sell my share of the house," I said. "You'll find all the details inside. You have 30 days to respond." Lindsay's face contorted, something between disbelief and fury. "You're selling our house?" "My house," I corrected. "Or my third of it. Which is no longer for your convenience to use. Or dismiss." "You vindictive little—" she began, but Patrick stopped her. "We'll talk to our lawyer," he said. "You'll hear from us." "I expect nothing less," I said, and walked out. For the first time in months, I walked with my back straight, my chin lifted. The next days were a whirlwind. Claudia found a buyer almost immediately, a retired couple looking to relocate closer to their children. They were flexible, discreet, and ready to move quickly. The offer came in higher than I expected. I accepted. Lindsay and Patrick, true to form, refused to sign the agreement. We proceeded to court. In the meantime, I moved out. I used the savings from my pension and a small emergency fund to rent a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet building on the edge of town. It was small, but it was mine. I took only what I needed: books, clothes, a few photographs of Mabel, and the dignity that had somehow survived the furnace of betrayal. I changed my phone number, closed the joint account that had remained dormant, and gave no forwarding address. Only Claudia and my attorney knew where I lived. When Lindsay and Patrick returned to the house and found my room empty, I imagined they celebrated. But that celebration would be short-lived. Days later, their lawyer received the court summons, a forced partition of the property. The law was clear. They had no legal ground to prevent the sale. The judge scheduled the final hearing for a Tuesday. I didn't attend. Claudia went in my place. I didn't want to see their faces. Didn't want to hear the last whimpers of people who had treated me like spoiled food in their refrigerator. Instead, I sat on a park bench near a small lake, feeding breadcrumbs to a pair of ducks who had become my daily companions. Claudia called just after noon. "It's done," she said. "The judge approved the partition. The house will be sold. You'll receive your full share, nearly $230,000 after fees." I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just said thank you. Then I put my phone away and sat with the ducks, watching them glide across the water, graceful and untouched by human ugliness. 2 days later, I received a call from Patrick. I didn't recognize the number. He had used a different phone. I considered not answering, but something in me needed to hear his voice one last time. "Dad," he said, and for a moment I remembered a younger version of him, clutching my hand at a museum, asking about dinosaurs. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you made it clear you didn't want me there," I replied. "I gave you years of my life. I gave you money, time, help, and you treated me like a disease." "It's not that simple," he said, voice cracking. "Lindsay, don't blame your wife," I cut in. "You let it happen. You stood by. You signed papers. You backed her petitions. You silenced yourself when I needed your voice the most." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You've always been so hard, so proud. You never asked for help. You always made me feel like I wasn't enough." "And you made me feel disposable," I said. "We both failed, but one of us tried to fix it. The other tried to erase it." Can we talk? In person?" "No," I said. "There's nothing left to say. The house will be gone in weeks. I suggest you find another one. I wish you luck, but I wish it from a distance." And I hung up. I stood from the park bench and walked slowly back to my apartment, where my small kettle waited, and my book, and the picture of Mabel smiling as if she had known all along that justice would come. Not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet finality of a door being locked from the inside. The day the house sold, I didn't go by. I didn't want to see the moving truck or the look on Lindsay's face as strangers stepped into the front hallway and laid claim to a space she once guarded like a fortress. Instead, I spent the morning assembling an old jigsaw puzzle at my kitchen table. One Mabel and I had started years ago, but never finished. It was a picture of a red barn in autumn, trees blazing in orange and gold. She had always said puzzles taught patience and perspective. I had learned both the hard way. Claudia sent me the final sale documents with a simple note. "It's done. They've vacated. Your share has cleared." The funds arrived in my account 2 days later. I stared at the numbers for a long time, not because I hadn't imagined them, but because I had never thought they would mean so little. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even relieved. I just felt finished, like someone who had finally closed a door that had been stuck open for years, letting in cold air and echoes. The apartment I live in now is quiet, but not silent. I've made friends here. Harold from 3B, who plays chess like a general. Judith from 1A, who brings banana bread every Sunday and speaks more truth in 10 minutes than most do in a year. There are community dinners, trivia nights, walks to the library, and the kind of small kindnesses that begin to stitch you back into the world. I volunteer at the local school twice a week, tutoring students who struggle with American history. I tell them about wars and revolutions, but I also tell them what history doesn't always say, that dignity is something you fight for even when it costs you everything. A month after the sale, I received a letter. It was handwritten in blocky script, folded inside a torn envelope with no return address. I knew before I opened it that it was from Lucas, my grandson, the boy who once sat on my lap as I read him Hardy Boy's Mysteries, before the headphones and indifference took over. The letter was brief. "Grandpa, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what was happening. Mom said things about you that I thought were true, but now I know better. I miss you. I hope I can see you someday." I sat for a long time after reading it, not because it healed everything, it didn't, but because it was proof that some seeds still sprout, even in burned soil. I wrote back, a short note with my new address and a photo of me and Mabel on our wedding day. I wrote, "I miss you too. Come visit when you're ready. The kettle's always on." I don't know if he'll come, but I believe now that some bridges can rebuild themselves one step at a time. Patrick never reached out again. Lindsay sent one email weeks later, cold, brief, informing me that they had found another house closer to her parents and that they would not contest the financial settlement. I didn't respond. Not out of malice, but because I was no longer interested in speaking to people who had spent years reducing me to an inconvenience. I think often of Mabel. I speak to her sometimes, not in madness but in memory, like reciting a prayer or pressing a hand to a grave. I tell her about the birds outside my window, the smell of fresh coffee, the neighbor's dog who insists on visiting my porch every morning. I tell her I made it out, that I remembered who I was, that I kept my promise to never disappear, not even when the world tried to shove me into silence. The past year burned through much of what I thought was permanent. Family, trust, even the idea of home. But it also carved out something new. A self not defined by others but reclaimed by quiet endurance. I don't need applause. I don't need vindication. I need only the steady truth of a life lived with eyes open, hands steady, and heart unburdened. And in this quiet apartment, with the window cracked and the sun spilling over the floor, I have finally found it.